how flowers reproduce. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the structure of a flower and what role or what function those structures play in plant reproduction. Then we're going to go through how egg and sperm are made in flowering plants. So flowers are a huge adaptation for plant reproduction because it allows plants to attract animal pollinators. Not only that, but it's also a much more efficient way of reproduction. And you'll find out more details about that in this section. So how can we tell wind and water pollinators versus, or sorry, let me put it this way, flowers that are pollinated by wind and water versus flowers that are pollinated by animals? That is going to be because of the flowers. So if you have bright colored flowers, that indicates animal pollinator. If you have smell, especially, that's going to be animal pollinator. There's even, like, sometimes you might think, well, flowers always smell nice. No, there's actually, I can't remember the name of it. I don't think it's Rafflesia, but there is a flower that smells like rotting meat, which attracts animal pollinators like flies and other insects that would feed on the carcasses of dead animals. So it's not always about being pretty and smelling nice. Some flowers, I'm sure I could probably go out. I don't think they've mowed the lawn in our park area yet for a while. Grass is a flowering plant, and sometimes on certain types of grasses, you can see little tiny flowers. If the flowers are not colorful, like they're just plain white. There's a very popular bush here in Thailand, which I have in my front driveway that has white flowers on it. So white flowers, especially if they're small, they don't really smell particularly nice. Those are indicators of wind or water pollination. It's really like these big, showy, nice, beautiful, good smelling flowers that are really for the animals. So here's a diagram drawn by Baum, I think from EP 10, I think, I don't know. Anyway, I try to include diagrams that students draw when they do that, and it's a really good drawing. So we know that early land plants didn't have leaves and roots, they had only stems. Leaves evolved from branches of stems, and botanists, which are scientists that study plants only, they consider flowers to be specialized branches and the parts of the flower to be specialized leaves. So the flower itself, they consider a specialized branch. And then you're going to have 4 whorls or rings. So we start with 1 ring here, the 2nd ring, 3rd ring, and 4th ring from the outside in. These are specialized leaves. All of the specialized leaves, or the parts of a flower, form from the tip of the floral branch called the receptacle, which you can see here, this part right there. So that's where all of the flower parts form from. And like I said, you usually find 4 rings or whorls from the outside going in. The first one, you can see, I'll just draw like the outer ring. They're called the sepals. These are the outermost whorl of flower parts. The function of the sepals is to cover and protect the parts of the flower before it actually opens up. You might also consider these a very specific kind of bud scale. If you remember, bud scales were kind of like those green leafy parts that covered up a bud before it opens. In the next rings, we have ring number 1. The next ring are the petals. If the plants are animal pollinated, the petals will most likely be very brightly colored. And interestingly enough, there is a lot of relationships of coevolution, which means different species or evolve together, where there's certain species of plants which are fertilized by specific animal pollinators that can see only specific wavelengths of light. So those plants, so for example, I'll just make up some colors because I don't remember exactly a specific example, but let's say honeybees. Honeybees, let's say, see only yellow and red wavelengths of light. So plants that are fertilized, or sorry, plants that are pollinated by honeybees will produce only yellow or red flowers because that's the species that pollinates them. The petals and sepals of wind-pollinated plants are going to be very small or even absent. The next ring in, the next two rings in contain the reproductive parts. So the first one is the male reproductive parts. So it's this ring there. The last ring up there that represents the female reproductive part. So the first reproductive ring with the male reproductive structures is called the stamens. That's what you call the whole structure. So that you can see, he labeled that here. The stamen is made of two parts. You have an anther and a filament. The anther contains the microsporangia, which are going to produce microspores that will develop into pollen grains. The filament just holds up the anther. So that's where you've got the anther, which is that orange flat thing. I think this is a lily, right? Lily is a really good, if you ever like are in a shopping mall or something and you go past where they sell flowers, if they're selling lilies or flowers like this, it's really easy to see the difference between the male and female reproductive structures. The innermost whorl, which is just here, this part right there, that's called the carpels, which you can see there, the whole tall structure. One or more carpels may be fused together to make up a pistil. Here we have a single carpel. At the large base of the pistil, we have the ovary, which you see here. That's this kind of swollen part at the bottom. Inside the ovary, of course, you see the ovule. That's the egg. The style is kind of like the female version of the filament. It's just the stalk that supports the stigma. And the stigma is the part where pollination occurs, right? So pollen can stick to the stigma. So either the stigma has hairs or it is sticky. Hold on a second. Forgot to minimize that window. Okay. Okay. So the four rings, again, we have the sepals, which protect the flower before it opens. Then you've got the petals. The next ring in is the stamen, which is made of the anther and filament. The anther contains microsporangia that will produce microspores that will become pollen grains. That's the microgametophyte for a flowering plant. Then you've got the carpel, which has the ovary at the base with the style and the stigma on top. And this is where pollination will occur. Okay, so here's a really good example of the flower parts. On this flower, the sepals are gone, but you see the flowers. This is a tulip, by the way. So the petals are there, and you've got, here's the stamen. And you've got the anther and filament. This is the stigma. Oops. This is the style, and then the ovary is down here. Most species of flowering plants have flowers with both stamens and pistils. In some species of flowers, they have male and female flowers. So in this example, I should have actually swapped those two because this is the female flower. How do you know? You want to look for a big fat ovary at the bottom. And also you can see this is clearly a filament, anther, and all of these little yellow dusty particles, that's all pollen. Okay, next we're going to look at how the ovule is formed. Now, this is one of my favorite topics in the category of plants because people don't usually think of plants as being that complicated, but this is actually a pretty amazing process. Excuse me. So ovules form in the ovary, obviously. An angiosperm ovule is made of megasporangium surrounded by 2 integuments. But the 2 integuments don't completely enclose the megasporangium. So you can see here, there's 1 integument here, and then a second integument there. But you still have where number 4 is, that's the micropyle. That's where the pollen tube is going to go in so that the sperm can fertilize the egg inside here. Okay, so at number 4, that is the micropyle. Number 5 is one of the integuments. Number 1 is well, I'll get to there in a minute. 2 is the ovule. Okay. The ovule contains a large diploid cell called the megaspore mother cell. So you can see that here, it's a diploid cell. The megaspore mother cell goes through meiosis and makes 4 haploid megaspores, which you see here. Only one of those megaspores is going to enlarge, the other 3 die and disappear. I might remind you that this is quite similar to how egg formation works in animals. When during meiosis, you have a diploid cell, which goes through the 2 phases of meiosis. But after each phase, meiosis 1, meiosis 2, one of the cells retains most of the cytoplasm, making at the end of it, so you've got a diploid cell, and then you've got the first meiosis, one of those 2 cells takes most of the cytoplasm. This is meiosis 2. And after meiosis 2, again, one of them takes the majority of the cytoplasm. This becomes the ovule or the egg. And these 3 are called polar bodies. And they degenerate. Okay, same thing happens here. The remaining 3 megaspore the remaining megaspore, I was like reading ahead. The remaining megaspore goes through 3 consecutive mitotic divisions to make 8 haploid nuclei. Okay, so let's just start here with the megaspore mother cell inside the ovule. So the same diagram I had before, you've got the integument, your micropyle is there. This inside is the megaspore mother cell. Okay, so this is the ovule here. So the megaspore mother cell goes through meiosis 1, meiosis 2, and you get 4 haploid spores, but only one of them enlarges and these 3 disintegrate. Okay, so you've got 1 megaspore. Then you go through 3 consecutive mitotic divisions. So you go through mitosis 3 times. So we've got mitosis 1 time, you've got 2 nuclei. Keep in mind that mitosis is only the division of the nucleus. So you can go through mitosis many times within 1 cell, right? This is 1 cell. We're not dividing the cell at all. We're just dividing the nucleus. So after the first mitosis, we have 2 nuclei. We go through, so this is mitosis number 1, mitosis number 2. Oops. This is 1, that's 2, that's 3. 3 consecutive. After the second mitosis, the 2 becomes 4. And this is the third mitosis, 4 becomes 8. Okay, so in 1 cell, we have 4 haploid nuclei. You can see from the diagram that these split up into 2 sets of 4, one group of 4 at each end of the cell. One nucleus from each of the group migrates to the center of the cell. So now you can see we've got 3 left on the top, 3 left on the bottom. So we've had 1 from each of the groups of 4 migrate towards kind of the center, I guess. That's going to serve a purpose later. They're called polar nuclei because they came from opposite ends of the cell. They came from each pole. And a cell wall forms around each of the 6 remaining nuclei. One of the 3 cells nearest to the micropyle will enlarge and become the egg. So between the 2 groups of 3 left at the end, whichever group is closest to the micropyle, and whichever one of those 3 cells is closest to the micropyle, that becomes the egg. After the egg is fertilized, the remaining 5 cells will die. So you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's only after fertilization. Now, the resulting structure contains 7 cells and 8 nuclei. This is called the embryo sac, and this is the mature female gametophyte. Keep in mind, we're still inside the flower. Okay, so if I were to draw, this would be the ovary, and this would be the style. So you can see, according to this is the embryo sac. We've got our 3 nuclei up here, our polar nuclei, the 2 nuclei here, and the 1 egg in the middle, the integument, 2 layers of integument, and the micropyle. So this is where the pollen tube, this is where the pollen tube will grow from the pollen. Actually, we're up here because the stigma's up here. So the pollen tube has to grow all the way down, around, and up like that for the sperm to go in. This structure is another feature that's in angiosperms, not in gymnosperms. This has an advantage because we are inside of a flower. It's even more protection than inside of a cone, which is where it happens in conifers. And next we go to pollen grain formation. This happens in the anther. So we start here in the anther. And very similar to sperm formation, in other organisms, you start with 1 diploid cell and you make 4 haploid cells. The anther has 4 microsporangia. These are pollen sacs. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4. The pollen sacs contain diploid cells called microspore mother cells. Each goes through meiosis to make 4 haploid cells. So we go from here to here. These are the microspores. The microspores go through mitosis and divide into 2 haploid cells. A thick wall then develops around each microspore. So from here, we go through mitosis. And we form, so these are 1N, so now we have 2 1N cells. And then the cell wall develops around it to form the pollen grain. The pollen grain is the male gametophyte for angiosperms. So remember how we made 2 cells because we went through mitosis after we have the microspores. We made 2 cells, 1, 2. So the pollen grain contains 2 1N cells. The larger of these 2 cells is called the tube cell, which contains the tube nucleus. When the pollen grain germinates, the tube nucleus causes the tube cell to grow through the style. Remember, we've got the stigma, style, down to the ovary. So the pollen is deposited here at the stigma. The pollen tube has to grow down through the style. The smaller of the 2 cells, which you can see here, is the generative cell. The generative cell forms sperm. 1 second. Yes. Sorry, my dog wanted inside. Right? Okay, good puppy. All right, now we get to pollination. Pollination is just the transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma. It has nothing to do with sperm and egg fertilization. It's literally just the transfer of pollen. Right, you can see that based on the name, ation, which is process, right? And pollen.
The daffodil is called an entomophilous flower because insects transfer the pollen from one flower to another. In their quest for food, insects brush against anthers and stigmas, effectively cross-pollinating the flowers. Insects are blissfully unaware of their vital role in the life cycles of the plants they pollinate. Some flowers, such as these foxgloves, have evolved in parallel with their insect pollinators. The size and shape of the flowers ideally suits the bumblebee. The markings and hairs on the lower petals serve as a landing strip to guide the pollinator straight to the nectaries. Insects are not the only agents of pollination used by plants. For plants that rely on the wind to carry their pollen, there is no need for insect attractors such as conspicuous flowers, petals, sepals, nectaries, or other temptations. The tiny flowers suspend their anthers and stigmas into the wind to promote cross-pollination. The pollen grains of anemophilous species are smaller and lighter than those of insect-pollinated flowers. They are also produced in extremely large numbers. Pollination is an all-important process for most terrestrial plants, since it ensures that fertilization will take place and that there will be a new generation of plants. The dandelion uses a special mechanism to ensure that the correct pollen is transferred to its stigma. The flower head is actually made up of many individual flowers called florets. The florets are cross-pollinated by insects, but can also self-pollinate. When the florets were growing, the closed stigma of the dandelion flower grew through the middle of the anthers so that pollen was transferred onto the style as it elongated. After a period of time, if cross-pollination has not taken place, the stigma curls back on itself to pick up its own pollen from the style below. The passion flower has evolved a most interesting method for ensuring cross-pollination. When the flower opens, the anthers flip over. Foraging bees brush against the anthers, taking pollen away on their backs. Sometime afterwards, the stigmas descend. Bees who are already carrying pollen from other flowers then transfer pollen to the stigmas as they continue their search for the nectar. Despite some elaborate mechanisms to prevent it, self-pollination is sometimes unavoidable. But self-pollination doesn't have to mean self-fertilization. Plants can chemically recognize their own pollen and inhibit its further development in favor of pollen from another source. Flowers such as this tiger lily, in which both male and female sex organs are located, are called perfect flowers. Where the plant produces separate male and female flowers, the flowers are said to be imperfect. Here, the male flower is the catkin and is called the staminate flower. The small red flower is the female or pistillate flower. How do completely separate male and female flowers ensure that they are in sync? Many plants have ensured that cross-pollination takes place by deliberately keeping male and female flowers on the same plant out of sync. In this corn plant, the pollen is ripe long before the stigmas are receptive. Therefore, the only way the ovules can be fertilized is by the pollen from another corn plant.
Okay, so there's two methods of pollination. There's self-pollination and cross-pollination. Self-pollination, well, hopefully both of them are pretty self-explanatory. Self-pollination is either the same flower or different flowers on the same plant, because some plants have more than one flower. This is generally not the most ideal way of reproduction because you're going to get genetically identical plants. So if there's any kind of new disease or fungus or insect population explosion that affects one of the plants, it's going to affect all of them. The more evolutionary advantageous method is cross-pollination. This is when you have flowers on two different plants, two genetically different plants. Plants that are made during cross-pollination are called hybrids. The type of pollination is important to the growers of a lot of fruit crops. Some cultivars, if you remember cultivar from way back when at the beginning of the semester, stands, I think it's like cultivating variation or something like that, cultivar, when we take one particular fruit, but we make different varieties like apples and peaches. Apples, there's like, I don't know how many dozens of different versions of apple, whether it's Envy or Jazz, the Fuji apple, Granny Smith, Red Delicious, all of that. Those are all cultivars. So we can cultivate different texture, different flavor, whether it's soft or crispy or sour or sweet, we can do all of that through manipulating cross-pollination. But some cultivars only produce fruit if they're self-pollinated. Other cultivars have to be cross-pollinated in order to make fruits. For example, kiwis have male and female flowers on separate plants, so they only pollinate through cross-pollination. Now, pollination can happen in different ways. I've already mentioned whether it's through animals or wind and water. The flower structure promotes self-pollination, and some plants have flowers with petals that completely enclose both male and female flower parts, which makes self-pollination highly likely. You also saw in the video the dandelion that has these little florets. So the styles grow up through the anther, so it gets covered with pollen. If they're not cross-pollinated, then the styles will actually turn around on themselves and pick up their own pollen. Aquatic plants obviously rely heavily on water. And a lot of plants release pollen into the air. If any of you guys have hay fever or allergies at certain times of the year, it's most likely because there's a particular type of plant that is pollinating during that time of year and you're allergic to the pollen. I also mentioned wind pollination. Wind pollination is more complicated because it depends on the release of large amounts of pollen. So wind pollinated plants are going to produce much more pollen than animal pollinated plants. Not only must there be wind, but there has to be enough circulation of wind to carry the pollen. If you just have like one gentle breeze that kind of knocks the pollen off of the anther and then it just kind of falls right next to the plant, that's not helpful. It has to be able to carry the pollen to different plants. You also have to rely on other plants or other flowers around you being close to you, because if you have two plants that are a kilometer away, it's not very likely that they're going to be able to cross-pollinate. And the fourth criteria is dry weather, because it would be a real shame if you had a nice windy day to carry the pollen, followed by an evening of rain to just wash all that pollen away. So wind pollination, a lot more complicated, but that's why they release a lot more pollen. Very similar in if you contrast internal fertilization with external fertilization. A lot of aquatic organisms rely on external fertilization. So the female will release her eggs into the water, and then the males release their sperm into the water. So they use the water as a medium to have the sperm get to the egg. But you have a lot of predators, of course, that will understand through behavioral selection where spawning occurs, and they'll go and they'll eat all the eggs, because eggs have a lot of nutrition in them, compared to internal fertilization, where you actually have the sperm deposited in the vagina through the penis, and then that requires a lot less sperm to be released. More what do you call it? Efficient, I guess. Okay, I said that already. All right, so another adaptation that plants can have when they rely on animals to pollinate is nectar. A lot of flowers will produce nectar, which is a nourishing solution of sugars. When the animals feed on the nectar, the pollen sticks to their body. Then they go to visit another flower, and they'll brush up against the stigma of the second plant and transfer the pollen to the second plant. So here we've got a moth, a honeybee, and a hummingbird. The hummingbird is specifically adapted to drinking the nectar out of very particular kinds of plants because of their long bill, or their long beak. Bill is for aquatic animal or aquatic birds. Beak. And finally, we have fertilization. So you need pollination first, and then fertilization. Just like every other fertilization we've looked at, is the fusion of gametes. This comes after pollination. The pollen tube, because it's on top of the stigma, the pollen tube grows down through the style, and as the pollen tube is growing through the style down to the egg, the sperm form. Pollen tubes usually reach the egg a day or two after pollination. In gymnosperms, remember, it can take up to a year. So this is yet another advantage that angiosperms have over gymnosperms. Okay, I mentioned that already. Okay, so as the pollen tube grows down the style, which you can see here, so you got pollination, pollen tube grows down and around. As that occurs, the sperm cells form from the generative cell. Remember the two parts of a pollen grain, the tube cell, which is easy to remember because the tube cell makes the pollen tube, and the generative cell makes two haploid sperm. Why two? I'll tell you why. One of the sperm enters the micropyle and fertilizes the egg. And now we go back to our polar nuclei, these two nuclei in the middle that were separated. I did tell you they had a purpose, which I bring up later. Well, it's now later. So one of the two sperm fuses with the egg, that forms the zygote. The zygote develops into the embryo. The second sperm fuses with the polar nuclei and produces a triploid nucleus. This develops into endosperm. Endosperm is what is going to nourish the embryo inside the seed. Remember, I always give you the example of a popcorn kernel. When you take a yellow hard popcorn kernel and you heat it, and that it pops and expands outward, all of the white fluffiness, that's from the cooked endosperm. This process is called double fertilization because you have two sperm, one fertilizes the egg, one fertilizes the polar nuclei to produce endosperm. Whew, just in time.